This is the ASUS ROG Xbox Ally X, and it's both super exciting and a little frustrating at the same time. The Xbox Ally X is the first handheld that, to me, doesn't just seem like a tablet with some controls thrown on it, but feels like it was more built for form just as much as function. There's a lot of thoughtfulness between the design and the hardware. You get amazing performance, but it's also a reminder of how hard it is to get away from the complexity of PC-based systems like this. And if you are interested in picking one of these up, there are some things that you should be aware of. So with that said, let's get into it. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. Gaming handhelds have historically felt a bit clunky to me. They often feel like a tablet with controls tacked on that aren't the most comfortable to use, but the ROG Xbox Ally X feels like the first one that I've tested that seems to have it figured out. One of the first things that you notice about it is how much the design is influenced by Xbox controllers. This was built in collaboration between ASUS, Xbox, and Windows, and you can definitely see the influence in each of them, both in the hardware and the software. The overall design language is clearly geared towards the ROG aesthetic with all the branding, vents, and patterns on the device, but the way the ends are shaped with contoured grips makes it feel just like a console controller with full-sized buttons and joysticks. It's definitely the most comfortable handheld that I've used, although it is a tad on the heavier side at 715 grams, but the ergonomics do a great job of distributing that weight. I've used it for hours at a time without having any discomfort, which I can't say about a lot of other handhelds. Having more of a full-sized button layout helps out a lot there, where you've got the standard A, B, X, Y buttons, D-pad, analog sticks, and bumpers and triggers, which, by the way, those triggers do have localized haptic feedback, where the haptics feel pretty decent. They're not as tactile as some of the more premium controllers, but they do give a good amount of feedback that makes gaming more engaging and adds to the experience, but that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to button functionality. To the left side of the display, you can see this 3-button cluster with a dedicated Xbox button that launches the game bar overlay. There's a view button and a command center button that launches the Armory Crate SE overlay that I'm gonna get into in a bit, but on the right side opposite those, there's a button to open your game library and a menu or start button. Finally, on the back you've got 2 assignable buttons that you can map to whatever you want, and I would say the overall build quality of everything here feels fantastic, where the plastic feels solid, the buttons have nice tactile feedback, and my only minor complaint is when you look at the left side of the unit. In the right light, the texture seems to be inconsistent in a couple of places, which makes this seem less polished, but that is a super minor detail. In between those controls is the display, which is a 7-inch IPS panel with a 1920 by 1080 resolution and a 120Hz refresh rate, so no OLED, which is a bit of a bummer. But for an IPS panel, the picture on here is fantastic. ASUS says this has a peak brightness of 500 nits, and in my own testing that was pretty accurate, where I got to about 475 with a contrast ratio of about 1350:1. That is about the same as something like an iPad Air or a Mini, which again is really good for an IPS display. Viewing anywhere indoors is going to be completely fine on here, and even outdoors can be okay provided it's not in direct sunlight. This panel does have a Corning DXE anti-reflective coating on it, which does reduce some glare and help in that sense, and the glass is Corning Gorilla Glass Victus, so it is fairly durable. Color accuracy I would say is decent, but not great by any means. It's got good enough coverage that nothing is ever going to look out of place, and it's totally fine for both gaming and watching content, where scenes look nice and vibrant, colors pop, and the 120Hz refresh rate combined with the internals produces a nice smooth image. Inside the Xbox Ally X, you've got an AMD Ryzen AI Z2 Extreme processor with 24 gigs of RAM in a shared memory pool, and a 1TB M.2 2280 SSD that is replaceable. And I do just want to call out that removable SSD. Not only is it nice that you can replace it with game sizes getting so big these days, but it is a larger 2280 SSD versus something like a 2230 that are in a lot of handhelds. And it's a little easier to find 2280 drives that are larger in size and more affordable. The performance on this thing is just as impressive as the design, where synthetic benchmarks are all fantastic for a handheld, but more importantly, almost every game that I've fired up on here has played incredibly well when you've got things dialed in. Graphically demanding AAA titles play without any issues on here. I've tried both new and older games on here, and all of them are relatively smooth, without having to tone down the settings too much. Running at full power, Forza Horizon runs on Ultra at 60 FPS with no problems. The Expedition 33 is definitely playable, jumping between 30 and 60 FPS depending on how detailed you want things. And so long as you have frame generation turned on with Battlefield 6 and have it set to balanced mode, it's surprisingly smooth. It actually feels like you're playing on a console and you're still getting outstanding visuals. I did find if I tried to mess around with settings outside of that in Battlefield 6, I would often get GPU errors, and I'm gonna come back around to the software side of things in a second, but as far as heat goes, internally this will get to about 80 degrees Celsius, but it does stay cool in your hands, where you've got a pair of super thin cooling fans in the Ally X that do a great job of dispersing heat. They do make a bit of noise when they spin up playing games, but I would say most of the time it's pretty gentle and not overly distracting or noticeable. Now, all of that stuff is great, but I want to talk about the software experience because this is where I feel like things need a bit of work. This is heavily marketed around bringing more of a console experience to a PC handheld. And I get where ASUS and Microsoft were going with this, but right now, this feels a little bit rough around the edges. After you boot the device up and go through all the updates, essentially when you start this up, it'll take you to the Xbox full screen experience, which is essentially a console-like interface made to mimic the Xbox console UI. If you've used the recent Xbox console, this is going to feel very similar, where it's supposed to feel like its own little app where you never have to go into Windows. There are some nice features in here, like a handheld compatibility program that shows you if games are optimized or compatible with handheld devices. You can install third-party platforms like Steam in here and see an aggregated game library regardless of platform or store, all within this one app, which in theory sounds great, but in practice, it does need some work. For instance, even with the EA extension enabled, it doesn't show up in the available platforms, and a lot of my EA games aren't even in my game list, and even when you click the Xbox button where you would normally be able to see recent games or close active ones, they just don't show at all in here, and it does feel a bit clunky where I've often had to leave the full screen experience by swiping up from the bottom of the screen, and then go into desktop mode to get things to work. I also had an issue where initially I couldn't get Battlefield 6 to run in here at all, and I had to edit the Windows registry just to get it to work. And you just run up against these little details where you do still have to treat things as if this were a gaming PC in some cases, which is fine. I just think that having Xbox in the product name might be a little bit confusing for some people, especially considering you can't play actual Xbox games on here. Also, using the full screen Xbox experience is supposed to reduce system resources and dedicate more of them to gaming. And to be honest, I don't notice much of a difference at all between full screen and desktop modes. So I usually have it in desktop mode because I do find myself moving between the two a lot. I do get access to a full Windows 11 setup where I can browse the web, download files, or watch content, where things are definitely a bit cramped on such a small display. But if I hit that command center button, I can switch the control mode to work better with Windows, which is nice. And I do just want to briefly touch on some of the other features within this overlay. Right at the top, I can switch between 4 different performance modes. Turbo mode will run at the full 35 watts output for maximum performance. Performance mode runs at 17 watts that has a nice balance of performance and energy conservation. Silent mode is great if you're just doing things like watching content or playing games on Xbox Cloud, and Windows mode will just default to whatever power settings you have set up in Windows. You can also set FPS caps, tweak resolution, or if you head into Armory Crate SE from here, you can even manually adjust TDP or fan levels if you want to get really technical with things, but there's a whole host of other settings in there, from calibrating and remapping controls to adjusting RGB lighting and managing the battery care settings, where battery life, I would say, is pretty incredible for a handheld. The Xbox Ally X has an 80 watt-hour battery, and in my own testing, I'm getting anywhere between 2.5 and 3 hours of life in turbo mode with demanding games, and about double that in performance mode. But say if I put this in silent mode, where I'm watching content or playing Xbox Cloud, I can get up to 15 hours on this thing, which is crazy. That being said, if you're planning on using this for prolonged gaming sessions and AAA titles, you'll definitely want to have a USB-C power bank handy, but I will say performance mode is still quite playable with most games, so long as you tone down the graphics or resolution a bit, so it is still quite versatile in that sense. When it does come time to charge, with the included 65 watt charger, it takes around 2.5 hours to go from 0 to 100%, but you can get around a 50% charge in just under an hour, charging through either of the USB-C ports along the top. Those ports both support DisplayPort 2.1 if you want to hook up an external display. I would probably stick to 1080p or lower resolutions if you're doing that, but the nice thing about having two ports is you can charge the device on one of them and hook up an external drive or accessory on the other. The only other thing to note with them is that the left port is USB 4 at up to 40 gigabit speeds, while the right port is just USB 3.2 Gen 2 with 10 gig speeds. But that's still more than adequate. There's also a UHS 2 micro SD card slot for expandable storage, which is a nice addition, and a 3.5mm headphone jack if you want to connect a wired headset, but I prefer to use wireless accessories when I can, where I've had zero issues with Bluetooth, whether that be pairing up an Xbox controller or a set of earbuds. With audio, there's just a touch of latency, but it doesn't seem at all out of place. Speaking of which, if you're someone who uses chat features while gaming, the internal mics and speakers on here are fantastic. This has a built-in mic array with two-way noise cancellation that sounds pretty clean and works surprisingly well for voice chats, where I don't think you really need a headset at all, and the speakers in here are one of the first things that I noticed about this handheld. Those are dual front-facing smart amp speakers with Dolby Atmos, and the level of depth and clarity you get with these, and the volume for that matter, are crazy good. Everything is detailed without any distortion, and I find it gives you a bit more immersive experience that's also great for listening to music, and of course watching TV shows or movies. Finally, probably one of the most important aspects of this device is network connectivity, because literally everything you do on here relies on being online, and you technically don't get the latest and greatest there. This is limited to Wi-Fi 6E, so no Wi-Fi 7, which some folks might be disappointed with, but even with that being the case, for 99% of people, it's more than good enough, where I've seen incredibly fast download speeds and haven't had any drops or stability issues during online gameplay or while cloud gaming, which has been surprisingly smooth. Still, with this thing coming in at $9.99 USD or $12.99 Canadian, it seems like Wi-Fi 7 should probably be something that should have been considered, and you do only get the device, the charger, and this little stand with it, so any accessories will cost extra, but outside of the cost, you're getting a pretty great handheld, even with its quirks. Every game that I've tried on here has played well, the controller design is amazing, and the hardware itself is phenomenal. My main gripes are with software, and the nice thing about software is it can be fixed and improved, which I'm sure will happen on here, but for the time being, I wouldn't expect this to resemble much of a console experience. Having said that, I want to know what you guys think. Is the Xbox Ally X something that you are interested in, even with some of these issues? Or would you rather stick with something like a Steam Deck or a Switch 2? Let me know in the comments down below. That's all I got for you today. I hope you found this video useful or enjoyable. If you did, feel free to hit that like button. If you want to see more tech-related content, or help me build a handheld gaming console that deletes your saved game files if it detects you haven't showered in 24 hours, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.